Hello everyone, my name is Ruchi Arora. I am working as an assistant professor in Bhavan's Leelavati Munshi College of Education. Today I am going to explain the topic Principles of Language Teaching, which comes under course title Teaching of English, having course code BED 120 as part of BA second semester. In this video, you will not only understand the various principles of language teaching, but you will also get to know how to apply these various principles in your everyday classroom teaching. Before moving further, let us first understand the general meaning of the term principle. Principles are fundamental scientific truths or propositions that explains or controls how something happens or works. Since they explain how something happens and how something works well, they have numerous applications across the field. Now let us first understand the very first principle of language teaching, which is the principle of importance of oral approach. As we all know that speech is the primary form of language. Remember how the child acquires his mother tongue. The child does a lot of listening of the language in meaningful situations. So, this listening, this rich and adequate exposure that the child receives, it serves as the base for his or her attempts at early production. So, according to this principle, if we want our learners to acquire English, which is their second language, we must provide regular and sustained oral exposure to them in meaningful communicative environment. Let us move on to another principle of language teaching, which is the principle of natural order. According to this principle, listening is basic to speaking. Both listening and speaking are basic to reading. Listening, speaking, and reading are basic to writing. As language learning happens in this natural order of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. But we generally see that this is done in other way usually in schools. There is a lot of emphasis on writing first, and teachers think that students will eventually learn to read and speak. But according to this principle, language learning is most effective when this natural order of LSRW, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, is followed. So, according to this principle, students should be given lots and lots of opportunities to listen and speak the language, and children should be given lots and lots of opportunities to read, followed by opportunities to write. Moving to another principle, which is principle of multi-skill approach. According to this principle, the four language skills, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, they are interrelated. They are so much so interrelated and interdependent on each other that due importance to all these skills, all these four skills should be given. That means that according to this principle, no skill should be neglected. And this principle may appear in contrast to the principle of oral approach, which suggests the primacy of listening and speaking skill. But that primacy is well acknowledged, but this principle says that no skill should be overemphasized at the cost of another skill. It means that listening and speaking should not be overemphasized at the cost of reading and writing skills, as all these four skills are very important and they need to be developed among the learners. We can't overemphasize, we can't neglect any one skill at the cost of another skill. Moving to another principle, which is principle of situational approach. Language learning does not happen in vacuum. According to this principle, language learning is most effective when the students are given lots and lots of opportunities to participate in appropriate, meaningful situations. Those situations are very well important for language learning to happen. So according to this principle, language teachers should try to create conditions for interaction or communication on the part of the learners, and should try to relate these situations with the child's real life and with the child's other subject also, because situations are very participation in meaningful situations is very much important for language learning to happen. Let us move on to another principle, which is principle of selection and gradation of language material. According to this principle, the language material needs to be selected and graded very, very carefully. The language material could be in the form of the text, the worksheet, the audiovisual aids, the teaching learning material. It could be anything that the teacher is using. And this language material needs to be cultural and gender sensitive, and it should be selected and graded according to the mental and psychological level of learners. Not only that, it should be suited to the child's motivation and learning styles too. uh, then we have principle of habit formation and importance of practice and drill. We all agree that we cannot learn any art without constant practice and drill. So language learning is also an art and is essentially a habit formation process. And since it's a habit formation process, constant practice, repetition, and drill is must. And this constant practice helps to build familiarity with the sound system, vocabulary, and structures, and hence it is very, very important for gaining fluency. But one caution I would like to mention here, that whenever you are insisting on practice and drill, you should not try to make it very monotonous and mechanical and routinized. The practice should be very meaningful and interesting. So the focus should be in practice and drill, the focus should be on meaning and participation in meaningful communicative activities. Another principle we have is principle of imitation or modeling. Imitation is something that we learn through observation, through vicarious learning, through observing others. So we learn a lot through imitation. So language is also learned indirectly, implicitly through observation. So according to this principle, since language is learned implicitly and indirectly through observation, teachers' language proficiency plays a very important role. So, as language teachers, we should definitely try to work on our own language proficiency, as teacher is the role model for students. And yes, teacher can also make use of some audio visual aids and some authentic language samples like audios, videos, interviews, etc. in order to give a broader language repertoire to its learners. Another principle we have, principle of learners' interest and motivation. We all would agree that without interest, learning can never happen. And with respect to language learning too, learners' interest and motivation is the most important factor which influences language learning to a great extent. So it is the utmost duty of a language teacher to generate a great deal of energy and interest among its learners. And language teachers should also find ways to help learners develop motivation and interest. And she can do by including a variety of constructive and activity based learning, role plays, dramatization, audiovisual aids, using of ICT. She can do that in a variety of ways, but down the line, she needs to generate a great deal of interest and motivation among his or her learners. Next principle we have, the principle of importance of immediate reinforcement. We all agree that reinforcement plays a very, very important role in our learning, and the same applies well to language learning as well. And reinforcement it actually promotes students' involvement and motivation, and it actually helps to shape their responses. With reinforcement, you can strengthen the positive responses of the students, and you can weaken their undesirable responses also. And this reinforcement could be in the form of verbal, like very good, well said, uh, and likewise, and it could be in the form of non-verbal too. For example, giving a smile, giving attention, giving a nod, and it could be in the form of written also, like well done, you are a good child, you have done well, or it could be in the form of some tangible reinforcement also, like stickers, star of the class. Likewise, such small reinforcements really help to influence language learning, and it really promotes learners' engagement and motivation in the class. Next, we have principle of individual differences. According to this principle, each of the learner of your class is different. Each of the learner belongs to a different gender, different socio-economic cultural background, and the learner has different learning styles. Some could be visual learners, some could be kinesthetic learners, some could be tactile learners, and each of the learner has his or her own personality disposition. Some may be introvert, some may have a high self-esteem, some may have a low self-esteem, and each one of them will vary in their aptitude, motivation, and interest. So according to this principle, uh, individual differences do exist in language learning. So we should not compare the language learning of one learner with another learner. That individual differences should always be taken care of. And we should not compare our learners with respect to that. And teachers should always, this principle also implies that teachers should always try to cater to the individual needs and learning styles and personalities and interests of each one of its learners. Uh, Her planning should be so flexible and so inclusive that it caters to the needs, special needs of each and every individual learners of the class. Next principle we have principle of striking a balance between fluency and accuracy. According to this principle, both fluency and accuracy are important, and neither has to be sacrificed, neglected, overemphasized for the sake of other. Because according to this principle, effective language learning happens when we strike a balance between fluency and accuracy. So language teacher should not only emphasize on fluency at the cost of accuracy, and language teacher should not only emphasize on accuracy at the cost of fluency. What teacher should try to achieve here is that language teacher should try to carefully plan combination of activities where a growing control of the structure core is being applied continually to gradually freer and more fluent communication. Another principle we have is principle of eclectic approach. As language teachers, you will be acquainted with a variety of methods and techniques and approaches, and sometimes you will be very confused which approach to follow. And this principle comes to rescue in that time, because according to this principle, language teacher should not be very rigid in his or her planning. Rather, the language teacher should go for flexible planning and should value the diversity of learners and should also value learners' autonomy and independence. And she should not stick to any particular method or technique or approaches. Rather, she should try to incorporate a variety of supportive multiple techniques and methods and approaches as per the individual needs of his or her learners. Let me give one example over here. There is an approach called phonic approach and there is an approach called whole world approach with respect to reading, introducing reading to students. And both these approaches are in contrast to each other. But this principle says that both of these approaches can be used together in one reading instruction, and which will make the reading instruction more effective, and it will suit to the individual needs of the child. Phonic approach goes from sounds to words, and whole word approach goes from the complete words to sounds. So this top down and bottom up, both these approaches can be used simultaneously in one reading instruction, and it will definitely benefit the individual learners in the entire class. Then we have another principle, which is principle of clear, appropriate goals and feedback and evaluation. According to this principle, language learning is most effective when teachers set and communicate attainable goals for learners and provide students appropriate and consistent feedback on their progress in attaining these goals. So feedback need to be a consistent, ongoing and continuous activity and need to be an integral part of the teaching learning process. In this way, feedback acts as an enabling factor for learning and facilitates and guides teaching as well. But two important points to note down here. First is that feedback need not be limited to achievement with respect to a particular syllabi, but must be reoriented to measurement of language proficiency, which is the ability to use the language appropriately in new contexts. That is age appropriate text, materials, topics, etc. Second point here to note down here is that feedback need to become a self-regulatory activity. That is, in developmentally appropriate ways, teachers should encourage learners to begin to evaluate their own progress so that they become independent, self-motivated and lifelong learners. Next principle, we have principle of comprehensible input with scaffolding. According to this principle, language learning becomes more effective when teachers provide rich input with appropriate context and support to make that input comprehensible to learners. That is, oral and written input need to be adapted in a variety of ways to make it understandable to learners. For example, teachers can make their oral input more comprehensible by facing students while speaking so that the students can notice their movement of lips and mouth and can notice their facial expression. This will act as a scaffold, as a support for the child to understand the oral input. And teachers can also, speak slowly, and she can also provide support by articulating very clearly, and she can also provide support to her oral input by increasing the wait time for response. That will really help the students to understand the oral input. And with respect to written input, let me give one example that you as teachers can add graphic elements to the text that will act as a support to the child for making the written input to be comprehensible. And you can also conduct pre-reading activities, and you can also provide alternate text if required, and you can also go for pre-teaching certain vocabulary. These are the few examples that I have given with respect to the written input in order to make it more comprehensible to learners. So we all know that comprehension is basic to learning. The idea here is to make the input, both oral and written, comprehensible to learners with appropriate context and support. I hope all of you have understood the various principles of language learning, and you have not only understood the various principles, but you have also understood how to apply these principles in your everyday classroom teaching. And if you want to read further about this topic, here are some few suggested readings. You can go through these readings in order to develop a deeper understanding of these principles in your language classroom, and wish you all the very best, and thank you.